The last words of the Old Testament didn't come with fire from heaven or angels in the sky. They came from the lips of a prophet standing in a land that had grown tired of waiting. His name was Malachi, and when his message was finished, so was the voice of prophecy. Not for a day, not for a decade, but for 4 centuries. It's often called the silent years, that mysterious span of time between the book of Malachi and the Gospel of Matthew. A time when heaven, it seemed, stopped speaking. When the prophets disappeared and God's people were left clinging to promises with no fresh word to guide them. But the silence wasn't empty, it was sacred, and it was preparing the world for something divine. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Malachi 4:5. The people of Israel, freshly returned from exile in Babylon, had rebuilt their temple, but not their hearts. Worship had resumed, but the fire had dimmed. The priest had grown careless, the people cynical. Faith was ritual. Reverence was rare. And so, with that final promise, God grew silent, not absent, not idle, but silent. At the time, the mighty Persian Empire ruled the land. Judah was just one small province in a vast dominion. The Jewish people had no king, no army, no independence. Just their temple, their scriptures, and their memories. Under Persian rule, they were allowed to worship. The temple stood again, thanks to leaders like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Sacrifices resumed. The law was taught, but the days of Davidic kingship were over, and the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, was gone. Out of necessity, Jewish life began to shift. Without a prophet to speak and with the temple so far for many, something new emerged, the synagogue. A local gathering place where scriptures were read, prayers were spoken, and hearts remained tethered to the covenant. It was here that rabbis began to rise in influence. It was here that faith became something passed down at the dinner table, not just at the altar. And it was here that the hunger for a Messiah grew deeper. They waited for the Son of David. They waited for Elijah's return. They waited for God to speak again. But history didn't stand still. While God's voice paused, the world began to move. In the West, a new force stirred, like a young Macedonian warrior with an empire in his eyes. Alexander the Great. He conquered with speed, strategy, and a vision the world had never seen. By the time he was 30, he had crushed Persia and stretched his reach from Greece to India. But Alexander didn't just bring soldiers, he brought culture, language, ideas. This was the dawn of Hellenization, a cultural revolution that would sweep across the known world, Judea included. The Greek language became universal. Philosophy and reason challenged tradition and faith. Temples to pagan gods appeared on Hebrew soil, and Greek customs crept into Jewish homes. Some embraced the change, others resisted. Lines were drawn, identity was tested. What did it mean to be the people of God in a world that no longer spoke your language, literally and spiritually? And yet, through it all, the people remembered. They remembered Sinai. They remembered the Psalms. They remembered the promise of a voice that would cry out from the wilderness. Though the heavens seemed silent, hearts still beat with hope. Because even in silence, like God is not absent, He's preparing. In the silence, God was shaping history, but the world wasn't done changing yet. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his empire didn't hold together. He left no heir, only chaos. His top generals, the Diadochi, carved the kingdom into pieces, each grasping for territory, power, and legacy. And right in the middle was Judea. The people of Israel, already scattered, already silent before their God, now found themselves caught between two rising powers: the Ptolemies, ruling from Egypt, and the Seleucids from the north in Syria, two Hellenistic giants, one fragile land in between. At first, the Ptolemies took control. Their rule, though foreign, was relatively tolerant. As long as taxes were paid and rebellion avoided, the Jewish people were free to worship. Greek influence, however, seeped in steadily, not by force, but by fascination. Greek theaters opened near sacred spaces. Athletic competitions, often performed in the nude, celebrated the human form, clashing with Jewish modesty and morality. New philosophies questioned the old truths. Hellenism was not just political, it was spiritual. It offered gods of beauty, power, reason, pleasure. And for a people waiting on a silent God, those gods could be tempting. But in the great city of Alexandria, something remarkable happened. There, Greek-speaking Jewish scholars began translating the Hebrew scriptures into the language of the empire. This work became known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, honoring the tradition that 70 scholars completed the task. The Septuagint became a bridge. For Jews in the diaspora, it preserved their faith in the language of their neighbors. For Gentiles, it opened the door to the God of Israel. Centuries later, this very translation would shape the words of the apostles and the story of Christ. Meanwhile, in cities across the empire, Jewish synagogues flourished. The temple still stood in Jerusalem, but now local gatherings became the lifeblood of faith. Here, men studied the law. Children learned the Psalms. Families passed on the feasts, the fasts, the rhythms of sacred life. Though the world around them changed, the people clung to the scriptures, and they watched, and they waited. By 198 BC, everything shifted. The Seleucid Empire under Antiochus III conquered Judea. At first it seemed a hopeful change. Antiochus was generous, cutting taxes, honoring Jewish customs, even funding parts of the temple. But goodwill would not last long, because rising behind Antiochus was a name that would stain the pages of history: Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a man who would take Hellenization from influence to tyranny. Antiochus IV didn't want diversity. He wanted unity under Greek culture, Greek gods, Greek rule. And Judea, with its strange customs, one invisible God, and stubborn laws, would not conform easily. In 167 BC, Antiochus unleashed terror on Jerusalem. He outlawed circumcision, banned Sabbath observance, burned sacred scrolls, and then he desecrated the temple itself. On the very altar once dedicated to Yahweh, he sacrificed a pig to Zeus. This event became known as the Abomination of Desolation. It wasn't just a political insult, it was spiritual war. The silence of God now echoed in a defiled sanctuary, and for many the question grew louder. Had God forgotten his people? But in the shadows of tyranny, like a spark was lit. A family in a small village would soon rise. Not with chariots or crowns, but with courage, with faith, and with fire in their bones. The silence was not over, but the resistance was about to begin. The town of Modin was not known for kings, prophets, or warriors. It was ordinary, too small to matter in the eyes of empires. But on one day, it became the spark that would ignite a fire of holy resistance. Seleucid officials arrived. Their orders were simple: make a pagan sacrifice, prove your loyalty to the Greek gods, silence your god, or die. A priest named Mattathias stood at the crossroads of obedience and compromise. And he chose obedience. In a single violent moment, Mattathias broke the silence. He struck down both the apostate and the Seleucid officer, not in a fury of revenge, but in a stand of conviction. And with that act, the quiet town of Modian became the birthplace of a revolt that would shake empires. Mattathias fled with his sons into the wilderness. Among them was Judah, the third son. History would remember him by another name, Judah Maccabee, the Hammer. He would become the unlikely leader of a small but fierce group of freedom fighters, farmers, craftsmen, priests, ordinary men, with extraordinary courage. The Maccabees didn't have numbers, they didn't have armor, they didn't even have experience, but they had something greater: faith. They fought not only against the Seleucid army, but against fellow Jews who had embraced Hellenism. Their battle was political, yes, but it was also spiritual, a war for the soul of a nation. And then in 164 BC, it happened. After 3 brutal years of warfare, the Maccabees marched into Jerusalem. They had reclaimed the city, but what they found broke their hearts. The temple, once the dwelling place of God's presence, was polluted, defiled by idols, ash, and the stench of pig's blood. The silence of heaven hung over the ruins. But Judah and his followers were not discouraged. They began to rebuild. The altar was torn down and rebuilt. The sanctuary was cleansed. The menorah, the great lampstand, was to be relit. But there was only one small jar of oil, enough for one day. And yet, it burned for 8. This miracle became the heart of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. But more than just oil and fire, it was a sign that even in silence, even in exile, even when the temple is dark and the heavens are quiet, God is still present. Judah Maccabee would fall in battle, but the revolt did not die with him. His brothers carried the mission forward. In 142 BC, they secured not just religious freedom, but something Israel had not seen in generations: political independence. For the first time since the exile, and Judea was ruled by its own people again. The dynasty that rose from the Maccabees was called the Hasmonean line. It seemed like the prayers of centuries had been answered. The land was theirs. The temple was active. The covenant had survived, but peace came at a cost. And power, would begin to change everything. The silence had been broken not by a prophet's voice, but by a cry for freedom. Yet the voice of God had not yet returned. The people still waited, not just for a king, but for the Messiah. And now, in the halls of the temple and the courts of political power, new divisions would rise. The war for Israel's soul was not over. It was just taking a new shape. From resistance to rulership and the rise of religious factions. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish people stood on their own soil, ruled by their own leaders, worshiping in their own temple. The Hasmonean dynasty, born out of rebellion, sanctified in sacrifice, ushered in a new era. The people rejoiced. The festivals returned. Pilgrims once again made their way to Jerusalem. But beneath the surface of triumph, another kind of war was brewing. A quiet internal conflict between identity and ambition. Simon, brother of Judah Maccabee, became both high priest and prince, a spiritual leader and a political one. And while the people welcomed the return of self-rule, this union of priesthood and kingship was unlike anything Israel had known. According to the law, priests came from the line of Aaron, from the tribe of Levi. Kings, however, were to rise from the line of David, from the tribe of Judah. Now, for the first time, one family claimed both roles, and the consequences would slowly unfold. At first, the Hasmonean rule brought peace and prosperity. Judea's borders expanded, towns were rebuilt, trade flourished. But power is a seductive force. What began as a holy resistance evolved into a political machine. The Hasmoneans made treaties with Rome and neighboring kingdoms. sometimes at the expense of their own people. They raised taxes, they silenced dissent, and they began to enforce Jewish customs, not as acts of faith, but as tools of control. Even as they defended the covenant, they sometimes violated its spirit. Faith became a tool of governance, and governance became a source of division. Out of this growing discontent, new movements began to rise. Movements not of swords or banners, but of conviction. The most well-known among them would become a defining force for centuries: the Pharisees. The Pharisees were laymen and scholars, teachers of the law who believed that God's word belonged to every home, not just the temple. They emphasized daily obedience, not just ritual sacrifice. They believed in the resurrection, the coming of the Messiah, and the authority of both written and oral law. In many ways, they brought faith back to the people, but not all agreed with their interpretations. On the other side stood the Sadducees, wealthy elites and priests who controlled the temple. They rejected the resurrection, denied the oral law, and believed that only the written Torah held authority. They cooperated with the Hasmonean rulers and, increasingly, with Rome. While they commanded influence in the temple, they were losing the trust of the everyday Jew. And then, there were the Essenes. Disillusioned by temple corruption and political compromise, they withdrew into the wilderness. They sought purity of body, mind, and spirit. Their communities practiced strict discipline, awaiting the day when God Himself would purify Israel. Many scholars believe it was the Essenes who preserved and wrote what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient texts that echo their longing for a holy kingdom. The Jewish people were no longer just divided by borders or empires, but by visions of what it meant to be faithful. The Pharisees not calling for holiness in daily life. The Sadducees clinging to tradition and power. The Essenes retreating to wait for divine judgment. Each group claimed to preserve the truth, but each in their own way reflected the growing fragmentation of Israel. By the time the Hasmonean line began to decline, Rome's shadow was falling fast across the land. Civil wars broke out among the Hasmonean heirs. Desperate for allies, they invited Rome to mediate. And Rome never left. In 63 BC, Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, ending over 70 years of Jewish sovereignty. He entered the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in all Israel. And while he took nothing, his very presence was a violation. The kingdom of David had not been restored. The voice of the prophets was still silent. And now Judea had become a client state of the Roman Republic. The silence continued, but it was not empty. Faith still flickered. The scriptures were still read. The people still waited, but the world was changing. And in the distance, the stage was being set for something or someone who would come not with swords or crowns. The Hasmonean dynasty, once a symbol of divine courage, had fractured under the weight of ambition and civil war. And Rome, the rising force from the west, had seized the moment. Pompey's entry into Jerusalem marked more than the fall of Jewish independence. It was the beginning of a new kind of rule, a rule cloaked in pomp, engineering, and iron. In the years that followed, the Roman Republic would evolve into an empire. And into this new world, another figure would rise, a man whose name would leave both awe and dread in its wake. Herod the Great. Herod was not a descendant of David. He was an Idumean, a convert to Judaism, politically shrewd, culturally Romanized, and deeply ambitious. In 40 BC, with the support of Rome, Herod was declared King of the Jews by the Roman Senate. But to many Jews, this title was hollow, even offensive. He was not their king. He did not come from the covenant line. And yet his power was real, and absolute. If Herod lacked royal heritage, he made up for it with vision and brutality. He became one of the most prolific builders in ancient history. He transformed Jerusalem, rebuilding the Second Temple with astonishing scale and beauty. It was said that to see Herod's temple was to behold one of the wonders of the world. He constructed cities, fortresses, aqueducts, ports, Masada, Caesarea Maritima, the Herodium. Under his rule, commerce grew, roads were paved, and Roman favor was secured. But behind the grandeur, there was fear. Herod trusted no one. He ordered the execution of his wife Mariamne, his sons, his mother-in-law, his brother-in-law. He killed anyone he suspected of disloyalty, not even those closest to him. And when rumors began to spread about a newborn king in Bethlehem, his paranoia reached a deadly peak. To protect his throne, Herod ordered the death of every boy under 2 years old in Bethlehem. A desperate act against a threat he could not see. Scripture would later remember it as the massacre of the innocents. It was a blood-stained attempt to silence a promise, to stop a prophecy in its infancy. But Herod could not stop what God had set in motion. Warned in a dream, Joseph took Mary and the child and fled to Egypt, retracing the ancient journey of their ancestors. While Herod's army searched in rage, the child slept in safety, and prophecy once again unfolded with quiet precision. Out of Egypt I called my son. Herod died in 4 BC, consumed by disease and paranoia. His death did not bring peace. Rome divided his territory among his sons, and Judea remained under Roman supervision, soon governed by imperial appointees like Pontius Pilate. The throne of David remained vacant. The silence of the prophets still unbroken. Yet the time was almost full. In the humble hills of Galilee, faith still breathed in quiet homes and dusty streets. The Shema was still spoken each morning. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Psalms were still sung in flickering candlelight. The prophets were still remembered, and the longing, the aching hope, had not faded. The people did not know that the silence was about to be shattered, not with a king's trumpet, but with the cry of a baby. 400 years. 400 years without a prophet's cry, without a fresh word from heaven, without fire on the mountain or thunder in the skies. For centuries, Israel had waited, longed, whispered ancient promises into the ears of their children. And then, quietly, without ceremony or spectacle, the silence broke. The first voice to pierce the stillness was not heard by a crowd. It was heard by an old man. A priest named Zechariah, chosen by lot to enter the temple and offer incense. He had no idea that his quiet service would become a holy interruption. As the smoke rose, an angel appeared, not in a vision or dream, but in visible, blinding form. "Do not be afraid, Zechariah," the angel said. "Your prayer has been heard." The child would be a prophet. The first in centuries. He would walk in the spirit and power of Elijah, calling hearts back to God, preparing the people for the Lord. Zechariah could hardly believe it, and when doubt crossed his lips, he was made silent, a fitting sign for a man about to witness the breaking of silence itself. But God was not done speaking. In a quiet village called Nazareth, to a young woman named Mary, the voice came again. "You will conceive and give birth to a son," the angel told her, "and you shall call his name Jesus. He would not be just another teacher, not just another prophet. He would be Son of the Most High, the heir to David's throne, the one foretold for generations." Months passed. The world still slept in spiritual slumber. And then, in the town of Bethlehem, on a night as ordinary as any other, he was born. No royal canopy, No celebration in the temple courts. Just a manger, a carpenter, a teenage girl, and the soft cry of a newborn. Breaking a silence 4 centuries deep. Heaven could not keep silent. A multitude of angels tore through the sky proclaiming, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." The shepherds ran, not to temples but to a feeding trough, to see the face of God. In that moment, the Word became flesh. The promises of Abraham, the covenant with Moses, the throne of David, the visions of Isaiah and Daniel, all of them were wrapped in swaddling cloth. The silence had not been wasted. It had been pregnant with purpose. 30 years later, that priest's son, John, began to cry out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him." He was not the light, but he pointed to it. And when Jesus came to the river to be baptized, the silence was shattered once and for all. A voice not of a prophet, not of an angel, but of the Father himself. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And from that day on, the Word of God walked. He spoke, he healed, he taught with authority, he comforted the broken and confronted the proud. He was everything the silence had prepared the world to receive. The 400 years of silence were not an absence of God. They were his preparation. A long inhale before the shout of redemption. A time to shape the stage, to ready the hearts, to set the world ablaze with expectation. And when the silence ended, it ended with God with us, not in thunder, but in flesh. Not with wrath, but with grace. Not with armies, but with a cross. The silence was never empty. It was always leading to Jesus.